We're live on this is a sad Monday. I just got a call from the daughter of Jim Eason, um, who tragically has passed away. Those of you that do not know um, Jim Eason was a great, and I do mean great, talk show host at one of my most favorite, if not the favorite, KGO radio. A Just a magical place. I didn't work there as a little kid growing up in the 70s. I had a special fondness for KGO. It was just a magical station. It was a more than a mere radio station, as I've often stated. And one of the people near and dear to my heart, who I didn't know that well, but I knew him well enough that when he left KGO, uh, Jim Eason, he went over to KSFO. Didn't hear him as much there as I did at KGO. And again, repeating, which I will do often because the way in which we work these days has to be stated. Um, Jim Eason passed away, I guess, was late Sunday, peacefully surrounded by his family. He was 89 years old. Um, and most of you who watch me, who have read me in the past when I was writing more, as I said, I got to know Jim. He'd call me. I made attempts to talk to him, which he was gracious enough to talk to me. And I couldn't go on the air because I was doing some fill in work at KSCO, uh, uh, Michael Zorling station down in Santa Cruz. And fortunately, got an interview among the KGO alum Lee Rogers, who himself passed away about 10 years ago, I think now. Uh, but Jim Eason made several attempts for Jim to do, not this show, this is relatively new, but a showdown on KSCO. And Jim wanted to do the show, but he couldn't. He had an NDO, which is a non-disclosure NDA, actually, agreement with Cumulus, and could not speak uh, on the radio. But Jim Eason was one of my most favorite and beloved talk show hosts. He literally made me laugh and was cause for many joyous afternoons when I was listening to Jim Eason. He was on KGO 1 to 4 in the afternoon. I always remember that Jim Eason was immediately after the afternoon news and would work from 1 to 4. He'd had other time slots. And as I indicated earlier in the broadcast, he left KGO, went over to KSFO, and then did some other broadcasts. He grew up in South Carolina, or was it North Carolina? One of the Carolinas, and spent a great deal of time, both personally and professionally, in San Francisco at KGO. He was known as the conservative voice at KGO, but mere politics does a disservice when describing Jim Eason. Look, he had his own vision of life and certain things, and that was evident in his presentation. I was kind of a young buckaroo who was interested in people talking politics, unless it was something really, really egregious or irksome or mean-spirited. I love Jim Eason. He had a sense of humor. He could interview like nobody else. He transcended politics. One of the times that I remember so vividly, like it was, to borrow a cliche, yesterday, was in the late 70s when I was in high school, and the Iran hostage crisis took force. Right. Remember that? 79, November to be exact. And distinctly right around that time, Thanksgiving, when these hostages were taken. And, we didn't know at the time they were going to be gone for, God, over a year. And Jim Eason was on like a missive. And one of his great times of broadcasting was that era, a very sad era. And granted, he was very critical of President Carter, who was president at the time. He used to mock the leaders, if you want to call them that, over in Iran. But make no mistake, he had a very powerful presentation. Oftentimes, if you can say there was some humor in that whole thing, Jim Eason was able to bring it out. And he had magical broadcasts, spoke to everybody. And that was one of the great things about listening to a Jim Eason, who, again, I have to repeat, unfortunately, lived a great life, but passed away, I guess, late Sunday. Maybe it was early Saturday. I'm getting this from his daughter, that Jim Eason was in good spirits, died peacefully, was not in any kind of pain, and he was surrounded by family. Again, just a little background. Jim was one of the great talkers at KGO in the era of Ron Owens and Owen Spann and Art Finley, Mayor Art, and Ray Taliaferro. I'm leaving somebody out, which is the case. So Bob Treber, Noah Griffin. I mentioned Jim Dunbar, Ted Wygant, under the stewardship of Jack Swanson and, of course, Mickey Lukoff. I've often stated, and will to the day that I succumb, KGO was bigger than a mere radio station. It had people that worked there. If you got to know people and got to establish yourself, it was like a family. I never worked at KGO. I was a connoisseur. I was a young bucker, as I said, interested in politics and culture and loving the fact that I can listen to these various people, these unique, special, very detail oriented, interesting, provocative, funny, poignant people at a time, believe me, folks, when you needed that, especially during the Jonestown era and the assassination of Mayor Moscone and Harvey Milk, and listening to various folks like Jim Eason, like Ron Owens, like Owen Spann, and early days. I was a little kid. I didn't get to listen much of Ira Blue, but from what I hear, Ira Blue was also a very, very, very powerful figure on Sunday morning. He did a religious show called Clergy on the Line. But today, right now, I want to talk about Jim Eason. I spent many times on the phone with Jim, and amazingly, he sounded, I think the last time I spoke to him was about 2 years ago. And I said, "Hey, Jim, how you doing?" and all that. And he said, "Hey, Rich." He sounded unbelievably, it sounded like the same Jim Eason. which I know is not a accurate forecast necessarily of someone's health or anything like that, but he was in good spirits. He told me that he was living up on the Motherlode area and that he was enjoying retirement life and listening and reading. And he loved, and I do mean love, he loved jazz, Jim Eason. In fact, I told Jim countless times that his theme song made me, oh, I loved it. The Dave Brubeck, Take Five. Dave Brubeck, Take Five, one of the signature songs. And I'm going to, as a tribute to Jim, I want to play the Jim Brubeck, Take Five. And those of you that are not necessarily into jazz, most of you are, some of you are not, you listen to that and you'll become an instantaneous jazz fan. But back to Jim. Um, Very nice man. And I know that sounds like a cliche. Well, everybody's nice. Jim was very nice. He talked as if he was right there. I told him the first time I ever met him, believe it or not, I was a senior in 1979, okay, going into 1980. And he spoke at this, it was like a public university down on the peninsula. I believe it was somewhere near San Bruno at a local college. And they introduced him, Jim Eason-KGO radio. And I was like, oh my God. And that was the only reason why I came, because I wanted to hear Jim Eason. And I talked to him about all the great interviews that he did. People like Arno de Borgerac, and he'd have on people like George Will, the great conservative columnist from Newsweek, used to work at ABC, a political commentator. Jim loved music. He had on Wesley Whitfield. Remember, Wesley Whitfield was like a torch singer, and from the Bay Area, and sang at all the great cabarets, and unfortunately was involved in a very, very tragic auto accident in which she was paralyzed, but nevertheless was able to survive, continue on in a wheelchair, unfortunately. Jim Eason would have Wesley Whitfield on, even in that mode, and it made for really interesting radio because Jim could interview. He had a knack for talking and creating humor, even in areas that were not very humorous. And that's why I loved about Jim Eason. And I was just heartbroken when he left. And as I said, I didn't hear him as much on KSFO as I did on KGO. And I want to make clear, if you only say that Jim Eason was a conservative guy, which he was, that would do a disservice to his overall work because he was interesting and provocative and, oh my God, funny and professional with a capital P. And I'm a little, if you can feel it right now, taken aback because look, we all are going to go one of these days, but you never quite say, oh, well, that was expected. And I hadn't spoken to Jim Eason in a while, and I had just mentioned him the other day, I believe, with Mr. Zwerling, the owner of the radio station down in Santa Cruz. And then I get a call not that long ago on Monday, his daughter informing me that indeed Mr. Jim Eason had passed peacefully on a late Saturday into Sunday. And we're losing too many great people. And that's in every walk of life. And of course, it's it's a certainty, right? Life, death, taxes, all that stuff. But nevertheless, I want to tell you that Jim was a really good guy and very special. And one of the reasons I just indicated why KGO was so magnificent. You have people that were completely individualistic, had their own sense of style and grace. And Jim had a had a tagline which I have used a few times. One which was very, very poignant and powerful in my mind. He always used to say, "Do what you can, but behave yourself." And then he'd plug guests on his show, and he would always say, "If all goes well," right? Which I've used. But to do what you can, but behave yourself was kind of special in my book. It's just such a talented guy and one of the greatest. And I hope that I've shed a little bit of light on this tragic day. But I know Jim Eason, knowing him, he'd say, "Hey, get on with your life. I'm cool, Rich, or I'm cool, Bay Area." Sounds like a cliche. He absolutely would be saying that. Jim Eason, you are a great man. And I am very lucky and fortunate enough to have known you, to have enjoyed your words of wisdom, your advice, your overall character. You were a special person and a special force, and you will always be remembered in Bay Area and beyond that, national, but mostly Bay Area broadcast lore. And I am so, so, so happy and fortunate enough to have known you. And my condolences to the family of Mr. Jim Eason, who will forever be remembered. God bless Jim Eason. Rest in peace. And thank you all for taking the time to watch this show and pass on the word that you remember. Those of you that remember Jim Eason will know why I have always said and will continue to say how wonderful KGO, especially the people who work on the microphone at KGO, were and continue to be. Again, rest in peace, Jim Eason of KGO Radio. He was 89 years old and he passed away this past weekend.